There's a homework assignment that's posted online right now, and it's only covering a single topic, inflation. We're going to be discussing inflation today and in class on Friday. I think there's maybe 8 questions on the assignment, but they're relatively smaller questions. And if I remember correctly, they're all problems that you just solve by hand. I don't think that you'll be using Excel on homework number 11. And then the project deadline is right around the corner. So the 17th, I guess that means you've got about 2.5 weeks for that one. And so hopefully you're making good progress on that. Today we're going to be talking about inflation. And did I start the recording? Yeah. So when you hear inflation, what you should think is price inflation. And this is something that we talked a little bit about at the beginning of the semester, like what is inflating? And it's not the amount of value in a dollar. That's not going up, because if the amount of value in a dollar was increasing, then things would actually be costing less. And so what's inflating is the price of items. And you could also say that what's inflating is the supply of money, because the supply of money is growing faster than the things that are being purchased with money. And so that's why prices are going up. It's just that there are, year after year, an increasing number of dollars in circulation compared to the amount of stuff that can be purchased with that money. So that drives up the prices when there's more dollars and less stuff. So we're going to be talking all about inflation today. And to get a real-world glimpse at recent inflation pressures, let me make this a little bit bigger. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is a really interesting organization within the United States government, and they have people who just check prices all day long. And maybe that describes some of you as well. If you're ever in the market for like a laptop or a car, sometimes you just keep refreshing to see what's the price here, what's the price there, trying to get the best deal. But for these people, it's actually their day-to-day job, where there will be somebody in Manhattan whose job it is to price produce at different grocery stores. And they go to the same stores week after week and just check on the price of different things, because they're in charge of a certain region and a certain category of pricing. And so all across the country, there are different regional consumer price indices. There are consumer price indices that are broken down by category. And so you can see here, compared to the last September 2023, how prices have changed. So this is September 2023 compared to September 2022. So overall, prices went up 3.7%, which is higher than the target of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is 2%, but it's a lot lower than we've experienced, where inflation was not as high as 9% for a little while last year. So you can see what's driving the increase in prices. And within the category of food, you can see that it's restaurant food or food away from home. It doesn't necessarily have to be restaurants. That could be gas stations, airports, restaurants. But food away from home is increasing at a higher than average rate. Maybe the surprise is that as a category, energy prices decreased by 0.5%. If you look into the components, and of course these aren't just weighted equally, it's not a simple average that they put together within a category. It's a dollar weighted average representing how much of each item is purchased in the United States. So for example, fuel oil is something that people use to heat their homes, mostly in the Pacific, not the Pacific, in the northeast part of the country. Fuel oil is common, like Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. It's not common in a lot of other places to heat with fuel oil. And fuel oil prices went down, but gasoline prices went up. So as a category, the energy prices went down, but what really drove the decrease in energy prices was piped gas. And so natural gas that comes into your home through a pipe has had a 20% price decrease over the last year, and that drove the category down to a negative inflation. So that's deflation. And it's okay for a single category to have deflation, but it's a little bit dangerous for the economy as a whole to experience deflation. And we'll talk more about that on Friday, why deflation can lead to some unpleasant side effects. So it's just interesting, and this is by no means the most detailed list of consumer price details, because, like, for example, within food, if you look at the full consumer price index, they have it broken down into produce, dairy items, and even within dairy, they have like milk, cheeses, ice cream. They really do go in all kinds of detail to understand what's driving price changes. And of course, the federal government isn't setting prices, but they do everything they can to make information available because of this idea that I shared earlier in the semester that, high prices indicate an opportunity. It's information for the economy to go in and fill a need, and hopefully when more people go in to fill the need, it brings the price of the item down again. And so this kind of data is really useful to a market economy like ours because it shows that, for example, when shelter, so housing prices went up 7.2%, if we know the magnitude of the inflation within a category, then it can help identify where opportunity lies for investors, and they can build more housing and reduce the price pressure that exists for a lot of people. So this is inflation kind of pictured in a really granular way with the latest details. So it's amazing how little certain things used to cost in the past. Here is a 1950 Hudson, which I don't think I've ever seen a Hudson or heard of one before. Maybe they have one. There's an auto museum here in Huntington. Has anybody ever been to the auto museum? Just me? It's really good.
Is that down by in the West End?
Yeah, it's the West End, kind of by Heiner's. It's a really good museum. You should go there sometime because...
Do you remember the first car movie?
Pardon me?
Do you remember, like, from Disney, the first Cars movie?
No.
Yeah, that's
Oh, so this is he's in the Cars movie? Okay. Good memory. Well, that character had a value of $23.65. That was the original retail price. And the amazing thing about that is vehicle production today is largely automated. Wherever possible, they reduce the amount of labor cost that goes into a vehicle because labor is very expensive, and now that the unions have negotiated a new contract with the auto manufacturers just in recent days, the average hourly cost is set to go up from, I think, between $50 and $60 per hour up into the $80-something per hour when you take into account the pension obligations, health care costs, and other benefits in addition to the salary. Labor is very expensive, so nowadays we have robots to assemble vehicles, but back then it was all made by hand. Of course they used tools, but they didn't have robots. And so when you think 2365, what that represented was a vehicle being assembled by hand, and it's enormous. And look at the size of that thing, just absolutely huge. Lots of material going into the vehicle. And it's not like it was only this Hudson that was cheap. There was all sorts of deals to be had in those days where prices were very low. Compared to today, I think we've talked about this already, the $86,000 Ford F-150. And that's by no means an aberration. You can get onto cars.com and find hundreds of trucks within 50 miles for more than $80,000. So it's really expensive. And the question is, why do cars cost so much today? I guess there's probably a lot of different factors. Vehicles cost what people are willing to pay, for one thing. And so trucks are very profitable for Ford. It's by far the most profitable vehicles that they sell are their light trucks. And they make barely any money on small economy cars. They sell those mainly because of federal requirements to have a certain miles per gallon on the vehicles that you sell. And so they can't reach the federally mandated average miles per gallon fuel efficiency targets by just selling trucks, which are profitable. They have to sell some cars that they barely make money on in order to get their weighted average fuel efficiency down into the legally accepted territory. So they wish they could just sell trucks because people will pay it. Cars cost so much today because I guess they're big. I mean, they were big in the past, but there was a period in the late 70s and the 80s where cars got small for a little while. During the oil crisis of the 70s, cars got small and efficient, but then in the 80s and 90s, they got big again. So there's a lot of materials there. There's a lot of sophisticated technology, of course. Cars are a lot more advanced than they were in the past. The 1950 Hudson didn't have anti-lock brakes, didn't have airbags. I don't think it even had seat belts. So there's a lot of technology where they're having to recoup the development costs for things like anti-slip, traction control, backup cameras, and all sorts of that. They're trying to recoup their investment. And it's also largely expensive today because dollars don't have the same value that they used to. Back then, there were fewer dollars in circulation, and so those dollars had proportionally more value to them. This is a figure that depicts from our nation's founding up to the present, well, present-ish. This is the best figure that I could find of long-term inflation over time. Now, what do you notice? What are some trends that you observe in this data?
Whenever there's been a major world event, that inflation has gone down.
Okay. What are some of the world, so you're seeing a correlation between world events and this figure. What are some of the world events that you have in mind?
Great Depression, both of the world wars, if you look around.
Okay. So, yeah, here's Great Depression. Civil War. Something happened in the Civil War, for sure.
Specifically in the Reconstruction era, you just see blue all the way down.
After the Civil War. There does seem to be, I mean, whether it's inflation or deflation, there seems to be a lot of volatility with economic volatility goes along with political volatility or social volatility. That's a good observation. Anything else that you notice?
Oh, well, after 1945,
Yeah.
1945, inflation is always possible.
Yeah, no more blue. Good. Yeah.
I want to say the reason why is because we lost the value in money, right?
Like why there's no more blue?
Yeah,
You're talking about the gold standard?
yeah, the gold standard ended up
Yeah.
cutting that around that time, so
Right.
started.
Yeah, the US dollar used to be tied to a certain amount of gold. You could exchange the dollar for gold, and they decoupled the value of the dollar from gold. Now our currency is what's called a fiat currency, where it has value simply because the government says it has value.
Didn't that start to be put in place by pretty much all Western countries during the Great Depression?
It did, yes. I think the agreement was called Bretton Woods, although I'm not a historian. What I do know is that when they decoupled the dollar from the gold standard, it gave central banks a little bit more flexibility in managing the economy. So not only is there no more blue, you'll notice that the peaks aren't quite as high as they used to be as well. And that's because they're able to, for example, the Federal Reserve Bank can add money into the economy during periods of economic stagnation and try to stimulate economic growth, stimulate spending and investment by low interest rates and more money. And then they can do what they're doing now. They're trying to cool down the economy a little bit because we went through a period of elevated inflation. And so right now, the reason why interest rates are high is mainly because the Federal Reserve Bank rose interest rates to slow down the growth of the economy and pressure on increased prices. So if we zoom in on recent times, just maybe in the last 20 years, here's an interesting figure that shows a relationship between wages and periods of recession. And obviously, if we're talking about in this slide inflation, and remind me, what's inflating? Prices of items, prices of goods. So prices of goods are going up because there are dollars in pursuit of those goods. And where did the dollars come from? They come from wages. Wages for work, profits on sales. So all of that money at the consumer level comes from wages. And the interesting thing is that during periods of recession, when the economy is contracting, when people are getting laid off, when things aren't going well economically, wage growth decreases. And then in between recessions, wage growth increases. And so the first effect that I think if we were going to line up certain things in this period, the inflation graph with the wage growth graph, what we'd see is that price inflation occurs when wage growth occurs. And I mean, that makes intuitive sense that there's going to be more inflation when people have extra money that they didn't have before. And especially in the United States, we prefer to spend than to save.
Is that around the time that both the man and woman of the home started working?
I think that, it's gradually been going up. I don't know, I guess maybe World War II was...
Two main incomes rather than one now.
Mhm. Yeah, that's definitely a factor today, but I don't know that I'd be able to pinpoint when that started. I think, down in, during World War II, a lot of women were working outside the home who hadn't before for factories and so on. But I think if you've got more people working, more people making wages, then that's definitely going to cause an effect on inflation for sure. More demand for goods because households have two incomes. So people live in bigger homes now than they used to. If you drive around the old neighborhoods in Huntington, like the Beverly Hills neighborhood, and just look at these houses that are about 100 years old, they're all pretty small. Like the average home was maybe like 900 square feet, maybe 1,200 square feet. And nowadays, people are not really satisfied until their house is approaching 3,000 square feet. So there's been, some people call it hedonistic adaptation, just the idea that you always want a little bit more comfort, a little bit more space, a little more quality, that you just adapt and your threshold for what you demand goes up. The other effect I think we could notice from the two figures is that wages fall during periods of recession. And of course, that makes sense that if employers don't have to increase pay because there's lots of people seeking jobs, then they're not going to increase pay if they don't have to attract qualified workers. So this relationship between wages, economic growth, and prices is really important for us to keep in mind, especially because there's so much uncertainty. This semester I've been telling you in problem statements, assume the interest rate is 8%. And you'll do some calculations just based on a given interest rate. But can you really know what inflation rate applies during a certain period of time? If you're making an investment now, if you're buying equipment and you hope to sell something in the future, how is the economy going to be fluctuating during those periods? And so we'll have a class specifically devoted to uncertainty towards the end of the semester, and we'll learn some tools for performing economic analysis when we don't know what the interest rate is going to be. And we'll look at different ranges of profits depending on the spectrum of the uncertainty that could occur over a certain period. Just to define a couple of terms, inflation is an increase in the amount of money needed to obtain the same good or services, so price inflation. And we can measure that as a rate, meaning on an annual basis, a percentage basis. Percent, of course, means out of 100. And so we typically express it as some proportional amount out of 100 on an annual basis. Now, one thing that's a little bit confusing when you hear about inflation, and in the news in particular, if I go to the Consumer Price Index here, so look at the gasoline. August 2023, 10.6%. Now, it didn't go up 10% in 1 month. It went up 10% on an annualized basis in 1 month. And so that's one thing that is almost always implied, but very rarely made clear in an explicit way, is that economic data is sometimes measured on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis, but when they're expressing how prices change, they're usually talking about it as, it went up 10% on an annualized basis. That means, like, if prices went up in 1 month 10% on an annualized basis, that means that if that same trend had continued for a full year, it would result in an increase of 10%. In absolute terms, it almost rarely, very rarely, are they reporting inflation in absolute terms. It's just almost always on an annualized basis. So you sometimes have to keep that in mind as you're reading the news, that the percentage of the inflation rate annual basis. So if you have money in some sort of an account that is earning an interest rate that's equal to the inflation rate, then you're not gaining purchasing power. And in fact, in the last 20 years, you've been losing purchasing power if you've had money in the bank. There's been almost no cash-like investment, almost no CDs or money market funds or savings accounts where the interest rate was higher than inflation. It's only just in the last maybe 4 or 5 months that cash rates on CDs, savings accounts, money market funds are now above the inflation rate. So nowadays you can have money in a savings account and have your purchasing power going up over time. But prior to just recently, your purchasing power is getting lower. And we'll talk about the implications of that. The real interest rate is the interest rate you earn when you take into account the effect of inflation. And so what you really hope is that you have a positive real interest rate. Now, banks aren't going to quote your real interest rate. Banks are simply going to quote the rate that they pay you on the money, and that's sometimes called the inflation-adjusted interest rate or the market interest rate. But the real interest rate varies over time because inflation is always changing. And the bank couldn't be expected to keep track of that necessarily. The only rare exception I can think of where you can know what your real interest rate is going to be is a product that's sold by the U.S. Treasury called I-bonds. Let me show you I-bonds. Hopefully we can find it. This uses Bing as the search tool, so you never know. I don't want tax information. Let's look up and see what the I-bonds rate is. Every year you can buy $10,000 worth of I-bonds, and right now they're paying 5.27%, including a fixed rate of 1.30%. So what that means is, as long as you hold that bond, you're going to earn 1.30% real return, but that real return is relatively small compared to the inflation-linked component. So these I-bonds, the reason why you can only buy $10,000 of them each year is they're pretty attractive to a lot of people because you know what is the interest rate you're going to get over time. Like, they always promise to cover inflation, but then there's a fixed rate on top of it. It gives you a combined interest rate. So they explain that you get a fixed rate of return, that's your real interest rate, and then a certain amount that promises to cover the inflation. So the inflation-adjusted interest rate takes into account the effective inflation and the real interest rate that you hope to achieve. And there's a formula which we will use to relate the inflation-adjusted interest rate, and it's probably better to call it the market interest rate, because if you think of inflation-adjusted interest rate, you might get the wrong idea that someone is actively managing I sub f. And it's not actively managed. It's actually subject to the vagaries of inflation. Like F, which is the inflation rate, it can go up and down, and nobody's in control of that in a direct way. The Federal Reserve is trying to guide it in the 2% range, but they only have indirect control over inflation. And so I sub f, as a consequence, since f is hard to control, I sub f is also hard to control. And so it's the market interest rate. It's what you're earning has some real interest rate component and some component that is related to the inflation rate. So let's consider an example. Let's say that if you went over to Kroger right now and you identified a basket of goods that you wanted to purchase, maybe that basket of goods would cost $25. And so it's a certain fixed content that you're going to look at again in 15 years. And if it's 3% inflation rate, you can calculate the price of the items in 15 years using the same formulas that we've talked about before. So, future amount is the present amount. And ordinarily in the past we said 1 plus I to the n power, where I was the interest rate. We can just substitute in the inflation rate and use the formula in the same way. But instead of finding out the amount of dollars that we have in an account, this formula would tell you what's the price of the basket of goods in 15 years. So if we had a $25 current price and 3% annual appreciation in prices, compounded over 15 years, that same basket of goods will cost $38.95 in 15 years. So if you save $25 today, how many baskets of food could you purchase if the market interest rate is 7%? Okay, so this is a good situation. The interest rate that we're earning of 7% is bigger than the inflation rate. So that means that we should be able to buy more food in the future than we can buy now, because $25 now will buy you one basket, but prices are going up, and at the same time, the amount of money that we have is going up. And the amount of money we have is going up at a faster rate. It's going up at 7%, whereas prices are only going up at 3%. So the amount of money that's going to be available in 15 years is $68.98, and that is much larger than the higher cost of the basket of goods. So our purchasing power increased during the 15 years. You have the ability to buy more food than you did in the past when the market adjusted interest rate is larger than the inflation rate. Any questions about these ideas? So the homework has a lot of little questions like this, where you've got one interest rate that talks about how quickly your money is growing, another interest rate that talks about how much prices are growing, and you have to kind of at the same time take into account the changing prices and the changing amount of money you have. It's not that complicated. There's two interest rates. You can handle them both. Okay, let me give you this handout, and we're going to look at an item that costs $5,000 now, and the price is going up at 4% per year. I'd like you to calculate what the cost will be in 5 years using F. That's the 4% per year. And then if you want your real interest rate to be 10%, and real interest rate is just I. It's not I sub F. The real interest rate is I. So for part B, you know that F is 0.04, I is 0.1. You're calculating I sub F with that. Let me give you these papers so you can get started. Okay, in part A, you're just calculating how much the item is going to cost in 5 years. If it's 5,000 now and it's going up at 4% per year. So we use find F given P, 1 plus the interest rate to the power of N. So we anticipate that the item will cost $6,083.26, assuming that the 4% price inflation is steady during that period. Who knows if that'll be the case, but we're just projecting. Now, our investments have to produce a real interest rate of 10%, then we're going to have to overcome the effects of inflation. So we want our purchasing power to increase by 10% per year. So we're identifying what interest rate we have to achieve with the investments. It should be 14.4% because it's I plus F plus I times F. So 14.4%, if that is the interest rate that we're going to earn on our investments, then that'll tell us how much should be invested today in order to have that number of dollars available in the future to purchase the equipment. So the item, we already determined from part A that the item's going to cost $6,083.26 in the future. So to buy it, that's how many dollars we have to have available. But our dollars are growing at 14.4%. So we're not going to have to put in as much money today as we would to buy the item today. So that's why the price that you'd have to pay today is less, is because the money you put in today is going to experience an increase in purchasing power that exceeds the rate of inflation. So this, I think, is pretty closely aligned to the types of questions that you get in the homework assignment, and you could probably solve about half of them with just the ideas that are embodied in this example. Any questions about this one before we move on to the second part? Okay. Here's an Airbus A380. Has anybody flown on one of those before? I've only been on it a single time. It's a double-decker airplane, similar to the 747, but all the way down the whole airplane. It's got 2 floors. It's a very comfortable airplane, quiet, spacious, but everybody thought that they maybe were going to go completely extinct during the pandemic because they have 4 engines. They're not especially fuel efficient. And so when the demand for air travel went down during 2020, all of these Airbus A380s were just parked and weren't getting used at all. They were using other planes that are more fuel efficient, like the Airbus 350, Boeing 777. But anyways, they're back now because there's been a huge rebound effect when it comes to international travel. Lots of demand, and so they had to bring these Airbus A380s back into service. If the price is $380 million, and we expect that price inflation is occurring at 9% per year, then how long will it take until the price is $500 million? How many years of growth until it's $500 million? So there's, I think, a hint on the handout. It says that you can use the log function on your calculator. I'll let you see if you can figure it out, and then if the relationship between log and exponents isn't coming back to you, I'll write some hints on the board here in a few minutes. So it should be 4.475 years. And you could just substitute the numbers into the equation, and your calculator has an equation solver, so you don't have to necessarily isolate n algebraically like I have here on the screen. You just type in the numbers and have it solve for n, and it'll give you 4.475. But this does kind of illustrate how we got there. So the thing to keep in mind is that just like interest compounds, so does inflation. that every year, if it's a percentage increase from the previous year, that the growth of prices can be really pretty substantial over decades, in the same way that the amount of money grows in kind of a magical way over 30 or 40 years. You're probably starting to see that on the project. You know, like if you're looking at how much money you've got in the bank by the time you retire, it almost seems like a fantasy. And the reason why is because when you start saving early and you have the power of compound interest, it does kind of do magical things. It really grows quite a lot. Okay, you had an exam on Monday. I have those exams in my office. I haven't started grading them yet. I just got back into town this morning. Um, so I'll try and begin grading those this week, but I've got a race over the weekend. Ordinarily, I just grade them all weekend long, but I won't be able to do that this weekend. So I'm thinking probably Wednesday of next week is when I'll be able to return those to you. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that it's going to be a little bit longer than the first exam. Anyways, that's it for today. I'll see you in class on Friday.